Hello friends, I am Dr. Urmi Satyan from School of Liberal Studies, Pandit Deendayal Energy University. The topic for today's discussion is an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. This epistle is a formal didactic letter written by the neoclassical poet Alexanderpope to his friend and personal physician Dr. Arbuthnot. In the advertisement that precedes the epistle, Pope calls it as a bill of complaint. So we can simply understand this epistle as a complaint letter. Now friends, when do we write a complaint letter? There is a possibility of n numbers of reasons, like when we find contradictions between truth and reality, when our oral approaches are not reciprocated positively, convincingly, when our sentiments are hurt beyond repair, or when we are put in a kind of moral witness box from where we are compelled to defend ourselves and we desperately need emotional support from our loved ones. There can be many such reasons, right? For Alexander Pope, all these reasons work together to encourage him, or we can say to provoke him to write this letter to his physician and a consistent friend, Dr. Arbuthnot. I say consistent because Pope had anger issues and had spiteful relations with many of his colleagues. But before we talk about the epistle, let us acquaint ourselves with a brief biographical detail about Pope. Pope was born on May 21, 1688 in London in a Roman Catholic family, and he died in 1774. He inherited genetic deformity and physical weakness, but that never obstructed his path to follow his passion in literature. He showed his remarkable skills in verse writing early at the age of 14, and then there was no looking back. The period from 1660 to 1745 is known as the Augustan Age. This is the time when classical way of writing verse, that is, writing heroic couplets, was revived. As Professor R.J. Rees says, that the form of heroic couplet was not, of course, invented by Pope. It was actually invented by the father of English literature, Chaucer, but it was Pope who brought it to perfection. And Pope himself writes in his didactic poem, An Essay on Criticism, those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. Pope says he has discovered the old rules for heroic couplets. He has not devised or invented them, but when he discovered the old ancient rules for poetry, he found them in their natural form, and so he has methodized, systematized that naturalness of the heroic couplets. We can also say that the classical rules of poetry were reintroduced by Pope, and so the age of Pope is also known as the neoclassical age. Pope's literary works are divided majorly into four categories. The first is satire, where we see The Rape of the Lock, a masterpiece of mock heroic poem. Another great satire is Dunciad, that is written in 4 books, and it severely satirizes not less than 100 poets whom Pope considers dull in wit and in art of poetry. Secondly, Pope has written didactic poems like the Essays on Criticism and the Essays on Man. The first presents the moral and practical rules for criticism, and the second presents the philosophical connection between humans and the universe. Thirdly, some lyrical poems like Ode for Music on Saint Cecilia's Day also captures our attention, and the fourth category is of his works of translations. Pope's translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey brought him fame, name, and a handsome amount of money. But critics believe that these translations contain more of Pope and less of Homer. Pope followed the classical writers and has reintroduced Horatian satire. That is, the satires written the way the Roman satirist Horace used to write. So let us briefly understand what is a Horatian style of satire. We can say that in manner, a Horatian satire is formal, direct and instructive, and in matter, it is purely subjective. A Horatian satire may not have a particular plot. However, it is highly expressive in terms of presenting personal emotions of agony, insult or betrayal. An epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot carries all these characteristics. So basically, this epistle is a long letter that registers how Pope has opened up his heart by giving a categorical account of the literary artist who flatter him and wish to be successful more through appeasement and less through their talent. This epistle is a portrayal of Pope's poetic and moral excellence on one hand and his attacking comments on the other. Pope severely condemns Joseph Addison, who in collaboration with Richard Steele founded the magazine The Spectator, we all know. The tone of the epistle is conversational, where Pope imagines a few suggestions or questions or advices from Dr. Arbuthnot and then responds to them with befitting severe arguments. So let us study the content of the epistle. From the very beginning of the epistle, we see that the tone of the poem is very subjective. Pope wants to be away from all the bedlams or Parnassus who have fire in their eye and papers in their hand. From the very commencing lines, Pope distinctly says that he is exhausted of them. He says, "Shut, shut the door, good John, fatigued, I said. Tie up the knocker, say I am sick, I am dead." One important thing to notice here is that there is no mention of his chronic sickness in this poem. It means that he feels more affected by the flattery than his sickness. He almost locks himself because he wants to stay away from the writers who are excited to receive his valuable comments on their dull art of poetry. Pope says that these poetasters rave, recite and madden or rally round the land of my house. Further, he names a few of them and says, there is a parson who drinks a lot and remains bemused. There is also a maudlin poetess, a crying baby kind of a poetess, and a clerk and a lawyer and a person who is locked away from ink and paper and is so desperate that he writes with a charcoal round his darkened walls. He also says that there are some like Cornus, that is Robert Walpole, who is deceived by his frantic wife and who writes poetry to curse wit and poetry along with Pope himself. Thus, there are many at the disposal of Pope's anger. Pope mentions some by their first names and leaves others to be recognized by the characteristics ascribed to them. When tired of their mentions, he addresses directly to Dr. Arbuthnot as friend to my life. As Dr. Arbuthnot is a physician, he asks him for a kind of cure, a remedy or a medicine that can remove his pain. Pope says, what drop or nostrum can this plague remove? Pope also says, my anguish is honest and my condition is wretched, as I can neither remain silent nor speak lie. I want to tell these poets to wait at least for 9 years before they publish any of their poetic compositions. Pope says these poets want not only an approval from him, but also, as he says, my friendship and a prologue and 10 pounds. He says that he was also offered a kind of bribe by one of the poets who requested him to revise and retouch his verse so that it can get published easily and also with immediate effect. The same poet also whispers secretively that if his poetic work will be published, he will share half of its royalty with Pope. This agitated Pope, so much so that he took a quarrel with him and smashed the door on him, saying, "Let me see your works, and you no more." This depiction of Pope shows that flattery and bribery were the meanest ways to gain success easily and quickly. He also draws our attention to the fact that originality or original creativity was a big challenge to some of his contemporary writers. We should also remember that Pope was a sickly person, and so he was extremely agitated when people approached him carelessly for their personal gain. He was angry at people whose poetic genius was ornamental and flamboyant and not integrational or direct. As it has been said, in the 17th century, there was firstly a shift in theory of style from extravagance, Renaissance to the theory of the Royal Society era, that the words should be strictly tied down to things. And secondly, at the same time, there was a shift from flamboyance of Brown and Donne either to a fully plain form of scientific prose of the Royal Society or to a superficially plain form of conversational verse of Dryden and Pope. Coming back to the epistle, what is more striking is Pope's attack on Joseph Addison. Here we see how a great satirist like Pope attacks upon another legendary writer of his time. Pope says all the other poetasters are forgivable, but Addison can never be spared. He says, "Peace to all such, but were there one whose fires true genius kindles and fair frame inspires, and without sneering teach the rest to sneer, willing to wound and yet afraid to strike." How piercing these words are. Pope calls Addison as Atticus and puts him in the most unfavorable light here. The reasons are many. One of them is, as critics say, that Addison was caressing in nature and Pope did not like to be patronized. Pope writes in the epistle that Addison was so obliging that he never obliged. Thus, friends, all throughout the epistle we see how agitated Pope appears for being surrounded by people who lack moral courage and follow the path of flattery for immediate success. One more interesting thing about this epistle is to see Pope's heart full of gratitude for some of his friends. He genuinely thanks his benefactors who encouraged him to write and publish his verses. He also feels sorry for the poets like John Gay, whose creativity was not adequately acknowledged during his time. He says, "And those they left me, for they left me gay, left me to see neglected genius bloom." Also from line number 135 to 145, if you will notice, Pope admires writers like William Congreve and Jonathan Swift and some of the knowledgeable friends of John Dryden too. He says, "Happy my studies when by these approved." We also see his sensitivity and gratefulness in the last lines of the epistle. In the concluding lines, Pope blesses Dr. Arbuthnot for a blissful life, good health and also richness as he had when he served Queen Anne. Pope also says that he wants to serve his aged mother and make her happy as he is the only support to her. And lastly, he shows his spiritual obedience by submitting himself completely to the will of God. Dear friends, it would not be wrong to say that Pope is one such literary artist whose impeccable genius is overshadowed by his personal antagonism and spite that is reflected in this long complaint letter, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. So friends, bye for now, keep reading and take care.